Hi, everyone. This is Mark Tracy. I'm professor of sustainable finance and investing at Brown University, specifically the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society. Welcome back to Banking on Nature. Very excited about the two remaining panels that we have that will be fully virtual. Um, this current panel, which will run from 1 to 2, is on Indigenous knowledge and rights of nature. And then at 2:15, we'll have an additional panel with some nature-related ventures and innovation, where some early stage businesses are working with different communities to create new models for nature stewardship. So with that, I want to hand it off to Ricardo Bayonne to give an introduction to the current panel. Ricardo?
Great. Yeah, thank you, Mark. First of all, we have some amazing panelists, but as is sometimes the case, we've had a few issues. One of them actually a nature-related risk that we can talk a little bit about, but essentially a flood took out a substation in parts of Nairobi, and as a result, Patita, who's going to join us, is not able to join us. Anderson Surui should be joining us hopefully shortly, but we'll get started. And what this session is about is, I think, one of the most important aspects of this whole question, which is how does the financial system interact with Indigenous people and local communities? What are the issues? How do we understand them? And why this is so important is because Indigenous peoples have been managing ecosystems for time immemorial, and in today and for eons have managed probably most of the ecosystems that we're talking about. And so nature is a very important part of their lives, of what they do, of their mindsets. And I think it's incredibly important to try and understand how these two things interrelate. Sometimes they interrelate well, often they don't interrelate well, and understanding why that is and how we fix it, I think is absolutely incredibly important. So I am pleased to introduce my good friend Beto Borges, who will be moderating this panel. Beto is a veteran of the discussions around climate, nature, finance, and Indigenous peoples. He's at Forest Trends, a nonprofit, and has been working on issues of Indigenous peoples and local communities and how they interplay with the financial system for decades, literally decades. So, he's probably one of the most knowledgeable people I know on all of these issues. And it's a real honor to have him moderating this panel for us. So thank you so much, Beto. I can't do him justice introducing him, but he's really an incredible resource on all of these issues. And I'll do no more than turn it over to him. Thank you, Beto.
Thank you, Ricardo. It's an honor to be here. You know, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, all of you that are out there. Thank you for being here with us, speaking to the audience. Um, and I'm really honored to be joining this panel also with Vic, Hogg, and also Anderson Surui. He just called me, and he is also having some troubles there in the road, a lot of a lot of traffic, but he said he's joining us, so he should be coming in shortly. Yes, this question about how conservation finance really supports or not traditional knowledge systems of indigenous peoples. The question is whether the market can support or hinder traditional indigenous systems and territorial governance. So we will be exploring this, and I have thought of three main overarching questions for us to examine together. What does meaningful indigenous governance look like in practice when finance enters a territory? because I've observed from experience that we are talking about different mindsets in different ways of looking into the world, in ways in which indigenous people's traditional systems, particularly connected to their social structures, how they go about making decisions related to their natural resource base, and the different ways about making decisions in relation to their rights and to the power dynamics within indigenous territories, and that differs from across geographies, that differs across different indigenous ethnicities. So how does then indigenous knowledge systems can really interface with nature-based solutions or nature-based finance, conservation finance, be it climate finance, be other uh, uh, forms of finance based on payments for environmental services, for instance, which are intrinsically linked with the way in which indigenous peoples and other local communities, Afro descendants and other local communities, have managed their territories. So to what extent can the best intentions sometimes are not completely inducive to really respect the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, such as the right to free prior informed consent, which is there's a lot of discussion around that. But what does that really mean in practice? Are we talking about, for instance, when we talk about even the C in the FPIC, the consent doesn't mean necessarily that once a developer, let's say a carbon project developer, it starts um, to discuss a potential carbon project with an indigenous people group or indigenous association, the legitimate representative association that represents that indigenous territory or their culture. It's sometimes, and I've seen in practice, unfortunately, that when developers go into this framework of FPIC, thinking that the C means consent independently of the process in itself, which may not lead to consent, whereas should be consultation. The consultation may lead to, oh, the project is not viable for all sorts of reasons. So then it'd be great for us to explore that, and to which extent FPIC, what does it really mean in practice, and how can it be a truthful safeguard for best practices for not only carbon projects, but for any intervention. My understanding here is that we're talking about how can we conciliate finance, particularly nature-based finance, conservation finance. How can we conciliate with the stewardship of IPLCs, the stewardship of indigenous peoples and local communities, in a sense that finance can minimize the risk of finance. If a project is implemented properly, and in order to do that, it needs to reinforce indigenous knowledge systems and governance practices in the same way that it strengthens their livelihoods. So I guess to summarize, what for me really what the take-home message in my heart and my consciousness is really can finance reinforce rights? Shouldn't then finance be a rights-based approach rather than based on return on investment? How can we then conciliate a rights-based approach, not only from the perspective of conservation and stewardship, but from the perspective of rights. To what extent finance can really support the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, because it is through their rights, to the respect of their rights, that we can minimize risks, such as risks of a project going sour. So these are some of the things that are come to mind when we begin talking about this this topic. And I'd like to, invite you, Vic, to share your perspective with us on this topic. So, there are three major questions, right? What does meaningful indigenous governance look like in practice when finance enters a territory? Where have market or financial approaches worked, and where they have not worked, failed, and why is that? And if finance were to truly learn from indigenous governance systems, what would need to change? So, from your perspective, Vic, if you could, you know, join us on this reflections. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you, Beto. I might start with an introduction of myself. Let's start with one thing at a time. And hi, everyone. Welcome to this panel. Thank you for joining us. Very grateful to be here. So, Bojo, Minawabin, Vic Hogg, Indigenous Cause, Potawatomi and Dow, Nottawaseppi, Niak, Indabendaguas, Potterville, Majiganak, Indochpia, Brooklyn, New York, or Lenape, Hoking, and Diane. So hi, everyone. Good day. My name is Vic Hogg. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a citizen of the Nottawaseppi Huron Band of the Potawatomi, which is a small tribe in Southwest Michigan here in the States. And I come from Indigenous and white ancestry, Potawatomi on my mother's side, and European soup on my dad's. And I'll start out by just sharing a bit about my sort of arc and where I've landed now, which is in philanthropy. So I started out my career working in leadership development, primarily with high schoolers, other young people, neighborhood leaders. And then I worked in leadership development and capacity building for survivors of human trafficking. I worked with Native and Indigenous survivors of trafficking from across the country to prevent trafficking on our lands. And that sort of led me to understand that I really wanted to do this from a more macro perspective. I wanted to be able to inform policy, to inform how Native people could have more control over our lands and a say over what happens to our ecosystems and our bodies. And that led me to pursue my master's in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School, where there's a really powerful research center there on Indigenous governance and rights. I think that anyone who ends up looking into Indigenous rights ends up also being involved in the climate world, because the health and well-being of Indigenous communities is so incredibly related to the health of our lands, our ability to be on our lands in safety, to use the medicines that we harvest from our lands, to raise our children on our lands. And so I ended up researching climate and Indigenous governance and the rights of land in that sort of Venn diagram through the lenses of Indigenous communities in the Arctic, through working with Indigenous communities in Kenya, which is how I met Petita and Kamunu, who is not able to join us today, but is a very, very powerful Indigenous woman leader from Kenya, from the Maasai communities. And ultimately how I ended up working with communities on the intersection of fighting pipeline construction, and how pipelines and other forms of resource extraction on Indigenous lands lead to violence against Indigenous women and Two-Spirit folks. After I graduated from my master's, I joined the National Wildlife Federation, working on our free, prior, and informed consent national organizational policy. So I spent my time at NWF working with about 52 affiliate organizations that make up the National Wildlife Federation, as well as our staff of 450 people, on how to actually meaningfully implement FPIC, more than just in words, more than an aspiration, but truly what does that mean in terms of where we put our money, how long it takes for us to move a project forward, what it looks like when a tribe or an Indigenous community changes their mind in the middle of a process and decides to withdraw their consent, and how to actually hear that, respond, and effectively pivot towards something else. So I did this work. I loved that work a lot. And one of the things that kept coming up for me was realizing how dreadfully underfunded the process of tribal engagement, I would call it, or just the process of meeting a tribe where they're at, bringing in elders and other community members and hearing what they need to move forward through an FPIC process. It was dreadfully underfunded. And we were mostly looking to philanthropy to fill that gap, particularly, at least in the United States context, in the light of a much more hostile federal administration towards funding these projects. So I decided to explore philanthropy and to see what it looks like on this end. Why is it so hard to move money towards these projects, truly? Why aren't foundations and other philanthropic entities moving adequate funding to resource these projects that we know work? And so I now work with the Solidaire Network, which is a donor network whose mission is to liberate wealth towards movements. And I run, at least in the United States, the only national fund dedicated towards Indigenous reproductive justice. I steward a fund with a council of 13 Indigenous women who all work in reproductive justice in some way. And all of us very deeply understand that when we fight for Indigenous women, we fight for land. When we fight for land, we fight for Indigenous women, and the interconnections of all of these issues that we're talking about today. So I don't come from the private market side quite as much, but I hope that I can still offer some helpful thoughts today. And Beto, why don't we start with one of the questions on the list to ground the conversation?
Yeah, again, what does a meaningful Indigenous governance look like in practice when finance enters the territory from your perspective?
Yeah. So I think that this question is really asking what does FPIC look like? What does free, prior, informed consent look like? And for folks who are not familiar with that framework, free, prior, and informed consent is an Indigenous rights framework laid out in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's a concept that's been advocated for decades by Indigenous communities, but I would say only within the last decade or so has been codified in law by many nations, many of which are on the continent of Africa. But I think more and more nations around the world are picking this up and actually institutionalizing it. The United States being one of the most far behind, maybe unsurprisingly. But when we talk about what meaningful Indigenous governance looks like when we consider how finance enters, I think we have to start by acknowledging the fact that for a climate or environmental initiative, the vast majority of initiatives led by non-Indigenous folks move those projects along at the exclusion of the tribe, at the exclusion of the people who are Indigenous to that land. And so even organizations that are doing what they might perceive as really strong and powerful projects to protect land, maybe that's protecting a huge swath of a forest that's at risk of deforestation, or protecting a species that is at risk of being endangered. That often is done sort of bulldozing ahead without bringing the community along. And the negative impacts of that are that, one, the outcomes end up being less strong, which is demonstrated pretty strongly across lots of different research, across lots of different nations. And then it also really damages the trust in that local Indigenous community working with external partners in the future. So it ends up being this kind of repeated cycle of like the environmental industry not really caring, stopping to ask and listen, and then that makes each partnership harder to develop. And so when we think about how the decision-making could look in a different world, something that I often encourage folks in engaging with FPIC is that it starts way before you speak with a tribal entity or engage an Indigenous person directly. It starts with the financier, the project leads, to commit to that process internally. And that looks like setting aside budget to make sure that you can engage a tribe or an Indigenous community. You can, compensate folks for their time. You can pay for travel. You can visit people. It looks like internally aligning as a team and deciding, like, if this community says no, this is what our plan will be. It looks like setting aside a timeline that's realistic for meaningfully engaging communities as well. Like when you're bringing in folks who often have less access to internet, or at least reliable internet, we'll say, who are often dealing with a slew of challenges, protecting their lands from destruction, quite literally, then you have to build in a flexible timeline from the beginning so that you can move through this process in a way that doesn't force a tribe into a decision without adequate information or coercion. And so I would say start that engagement from the very beginning. Decisions should be, made at basically, like, any decisions about the project itself should not be made until Indigenous communities are adequately engaged. I think that there's many, many different models for how FPIC can be pursued. And it really sort of depends on the project. And I'd be happy to share maybe some resources in a follow-up email or something about what that can look like. But I would say that one thing to consider, and a thing that I see a lot of organizations do that's a failure, is to engage maybe one or two members of a community, and then to think that that means that they've engaged in a meaningful consent process, to take that one or two individuals' word as actual consent from the entire community. And what we know is that, that, as it would be true in any community, that's not really how it works. There are cultural protocols in place that tribes have, where they have either elected councils or council members who are granted that honor and that role through lineage, through training by elders. And so I would say to try and understand deeply the cultural protocols in place of the community that you're working with, and then to ask for permission to be involved in that process in the ways that the tribe or Indigenous community wants you to be. And so that community will often have a strong idea of how long they would need, what steps would be required for them to really feel like they've put the information in front of their people and gotten everybody's opinions in enough way that they could meaningfully provide consent. And there will be appointed people within those communities to provide that consent. But it needs to be ascertain from you that that is what's actually happening before you interpret a word or two from one or two individuals as a go-ahead.
Great, Vic. Thank you so much. That jumps to mind that there's no like a given recipe. Let's say, like there's here how you go about FPIC, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I've noticed, it's really unfortunate, by the way, Anderson Suri, one of the Suri people in Brazil, he was, scheduled to join us, but he also had a problem on the road there. So he lives in a remote part of the Amazon in Brazil, Cacoal. So, but what we can do, because the hope here was also to, like you're speaking, Vic, speaking from practical experiences, even though I cannot speak in the name of the Suri people, because I'm not from that ethnic group, but I can speak from our experience, Forest Friends and myself in particular, experience when we conceived and implemented the Suri Carbon Project. For those of you who in the audience who are not familiar, the Suri Carbon Project was the first RAD project that was developed by the Suri people in Brazil, meaning that they were the ones that they led the PDD, the project design document, which is part of, in the case of a carbon project, one of the first things that is done. And we put together a coalition of organizations in order to support the Suri people to develop their project and bring their project to market. We sold credits, and at the time it was the VCS, the Voluntary Carbon Standard, and CCBA, the Community Climate Biodiversity Alliance, and we got the credits to be validated by both, including gold CCBA. And we sold the credits to Natura, one of the largest Brazilian companies that it's in the business of cosmetics. So it was a really rich experience in many ways. Well, first of all, reflecting on FPIC, many of the things that you mentioned there, Vic, really speaks to the experience that we had. And one of the major takeaways, and I think that be great for everybody here to reflect on that FPIC, and I'm sure I believe you agree, that FPIC doesn't have an end in itself. It's not a checklist. Okay, we've done the FPIC. It is a continuous process. Which is it's in part, it is influenced by all those factors that you mentioned, and also when we're talking about, in the case of Brazil, my friends, we're talking about 200 approximately 270 distinct indigenous ethnicities, wherein there are many different social structures, like you were speaking of the cultural protocols. It is that's why we can't really, first of all, it's not a check box. It is a continuous process. It is a process that it is shaped and is designed, should be designed by the very social structures of the particular group that one is working with. There are other also it's extremely important. We experienced that, and that was a hard lesson for the Surui project, that the power dynamics, what are to understand the power dynamics with that particular group that one is working with. Are we talking with the legitimate representatives of that particular indigenous group, or in the case of the Surui project, when we began, there were that they have, they used to have 6 clans, but they were first contacted in the mid 80s, and which reduced them to 4 clans. The 4 clans, what are the power structures within those clans, and how does the word of women is taken into account, or is not taken into account? Oftentimes is not taken into account. So these are all things that influence how FPIC is constructed, so that when we talk about FPIC, when we take it apart, F, free, prior, inform, consult/consultation, all these things need to be taken into account very seriously. If each part, the foundation of FPIC, each one of those letters, they mean a lot, right? Free of coercion. I'm not very personally, and I think I can speak on behalf of Forest Trends, we are not very favorable to carbon project developers that are doing the FPIC. They're the ones doing the FPIC because it's subject that there is a conflict of interest there, especially when they come into FPIC from this perspective of, oh, this is just a process towards consent, when it's not. So I think there, and you spoke, Vic, I think it's great that you're now with philanthropy, right? Is that, did I? Yeah, great. And I used to be in that world as well. I used to work with the Goldman Goldman Foundation. And for us, as we think through these things, to what extent, how can financial systems strengthen or negatively impact indigenous traditional stewardship? So what is then the role of public funds, philanthropic funds, and the market? How can all this financial flows, how can they really contribute to to nature-based solutions? To be honest with you all, and I may not be, maybe I'm getting old, I'm getting a little, this when I began to hear about nature-based solutions as if was the whole new, the best thing in the world all of a sudden. So wait a minute, I mean, indigenous peoples, they are nature-based solutions. Like all of this hype now about nature-based solutions as if it just came to be. Same thing with sustainable development. Oh no, sustainable development. Let's look back at indigenous knowledge systems. Those are the nature-based solutions. How can we support their rights so that they can bring their traditional wisdom and help us find ways to get out of this box? I'll pass back to you, Vicky, with this idea that be great to hear. And I'm probably already getting out of the three main questions here, but because this is exciting. When we try to conciliate, we're talking about, in my head, probably we're talking about two completely different world visions, right? Views. How then, when we talk about the metrics of conservation, which in essence is within the architecture of REDD, right? And there are problems there, including problems related to baseline, problems related to the impact of conservation, the key indicator to measure impact, and it's more problematic in case of nature-based solutions when the metrics are only, and it seems to me that the metrics, they're more concerned with the environmental impact rather they are concerned with the social impact. When you look at carbon standards, the different standards that there are, the great majority of them, perhaps all of them, perhaps with exception of one that is just started, were developed not with the social impact in mind. They were developed with the environmental impact in mind. How can this reduce or mitigate emissions, which is extremely important. But it misses the point that emissions can only be reduced through the proper stewardship of indigenous peoples and local communities. So then the metrics of Western thinking, academicist thinking, is that, which is, I'm not, dismissing it, but the metrics, I'm just saying that the metrics of Western thinking is different than the metrics of indigenous peoples and local communities. Indigenous peoples and local communities, I have the privilege to be working with them for over 40 years. And I learned a few things, one of which is that how they measure conservation is different than how the academia, the Western way of measuring environmental impact and even social impact is done. And I think what we need to get at, how do we find the middle ground? How can we leverage and support the indigenous science, indigenous wisdom to find metrics that work for everyone, metrics that will give the confidence to investors, because they need that. The market needs that. And that's extremely important. But how can those metrics be realistic? How can they really be grounded so that these two worlds can come together? So could you, go into that?
Yeah, no, I mean, you're bringing up like the core of the challenge, right? Like, how do we measure success? How does the environmental sector measure success? And how do we make well-being to Indigenous communities an essential component of that rather than just a potential add-on? I think the key that people really need to understand, that I feel like I continue to come back to, is that when Indigenous people are involved in environmental or conservation initiatives, those initiatives are more successful. And so if the bottom line is outcomes for the environment, it's key to truly internalize the fact that those outcomes will be better when Indigenous communities are involved from an early perspective, from and in a holistic partnership way. And so there's some interesting models for how that can be done to really view Indigenous peoples as partners in this work. The way that I met Petita, who is going to be one of the panelists on this panel, was through a company called Earthacre, in which she is one of the founders. I was part of, the small early team of Earthacre, and the idea there was to acknowledge that the existing carbon market, though maybe having extreme, benefits towards carbon capture, was obviously not holistically benefiting ecosystems. It might lead to more monoculture. It certainly excluded Indigenous people from those projects often. So in Kenya, we can look to the conservation work that's been done by the Maasai communities and say that those communities clearly have played a critical role in conserving nearly all of the remaining biodiversity of the nation. And those communities should be compensated for that work appropriately, right? If they are essentially the ones that are maintaining the biodiversity, then how can we involve them in potentially an alternative model of compensation and offsets that incorporates biodiversity as a metric? And so, that is essentially what Earthacre is attempting to do. There's been a lot of success with the company in doing that. And I know that there's been a growing market for biodiversity credits and other credits that sort of allow for more holistic and health-oriented metric systems for measuring success. I want to also point to a couple of other successful examples. I see a question that came in from an audience member asking, why do non-Indigenous people with project initiatives not include Indigenous people from the beginning? And what projects have I worked on or know of that have been successful with strong, genuine FPIC engagement? I think that this is very related to your question, Beto. I think that non-Indigenous folks often don't involve Indigenous communities truly, I think, because of just a lack of understanding. Like, if I'm assuming best intentions, there's a lot of, I think, people who would like to do that, but maybe don't know a single Indigenous person and don't know really where to even start in their community. Didn't know that there was an Indigenous community near them on the lands in which they're about to start a project. And so there's a certain amount of humility and challenge of just coming to the table and being like, I have a lot to learn as a person who is working in the environmental sector, and I might be entering a space in which I don't really know a whole lot. Whereas I've seen really, really strong partnerships work. And one I want to highlight, there's a ton of really amazing work that's happening in the state of Maine in the United States. There is the Penobscot River Restoration Project, which has been a river-wide project to remove the dams that have dramatically decreased the salmon population. And it's been done really in close partnership with the state, national conservation agencies, and then tribal communities in Maine, who are extremely well organized and have been doing a lot of amazing conservation work for a long time. And the amazing example of how that can look is these entities using the resources that are at their disposal. So, in the government and philanthropic sides, that's financial resources, that's legal reach, the ability to actually remove infrastructure and get those types of big projects off the ground and involve other agencies as necessary. And then working with Indigenous communities, both to monitor the impacts of the ecosystems after the dams are removed, or to monitor the health of the salmon and the counts of the salmon before the dams are removed, so that there's a metric to point to once it's done, to say how successful this was. And also just to listen to the local communities there on how the salmon populations have changed over time based on their own intimate relationship and knowledge of the river. There's also another project I'd like to point out called the First Light Learning Journey in Maine, which was essentially started as a way for Maine non-Indigenous folks to learn and participate in land back. And so it started, I think, which is a really beautiful model, as a learning journey, like learning about the land they're on, acknowledging the sort of lack of acknowledging the lack of understanding first, but with the heart and the intention there to learn and to do what they believed was right. And that opened up the doorway for a really beautiful collaboration with the Wabanaki Alliance. I believe I'm saying that right, the Wabanaki Alliance. And if somebody knows a correction in this room, please correct me. But basically what's happened is this incredible community of non-Indigenous folks who are committed to the learning and committed to putting their money where their mouth is, has pooled into a fund that can be stewarded by the tribes of Maine to pursue projects around things like conservation and around land back. And this is something I'm really interested in as a philanthropy person, is how organizations, financiers, individuals with wealth who believe in this, who want to do something with it, but don't really know where to start, how intermediary organizations like foundations or Indigenous-led funds can be a place that sort of enables FPIC to happen. Like my fund is in deep relationship with Indigenous women across the country. And when we are thinking about where money should go, it's in conversation with a lot of different people on the ground. And I think that there are more and more Indigenous-led intermediaries that can play a really pivotal role in what FPIC could look like. But the key for a non-Indigenous entity or individual is always, always, always to ensure that the project that you're leading, supporting is truly Indigenous-led, not a white or non-Indigenous led project with maybe one Indigenous team member who's offering some opinions. Not to discredit those opinions, they're very important, but it goes back to that ensuring that you're truly getting consent. You need to know that you are working with an organization that is vetted and that the community has entrusted to move projects along, often on their behalf. And so, I'll pause there because I know I said a lot.
And a lot of good things. I don't see the name of the person who asked this good question here, but the project that I mentioned, it was with the Surui Carbon Project. It was developed by them. They approached us. I have strong reservations about coming with a big idea to, my Indigenous and local community friends to say, what about we do this? So fortunately, we've had continue to have the privilege for them to come to us, to co-develop projects together. And that brings me to a major area right now, which is we have voluntary carbon market, world in itself, and we have jurisdictional RED programs, right? Programs meaning RED projects or programs that are led by governments. Probably many of you in the audience have heard about the LEAF Coalition, which stands for, if I remember correctly, the Lowering Emissions LEAF, Lowering Emissions Advancing Finance, which is, I think they have about $2 billion in movement. I don't know if it's an endowment necessarily. It's a coalition of several major corporations that are investing in this so that they can fund programs that led by governments to reduce deforestation and therefore mitigate climate change. And I think that we, for instance, we are advocates of both jurisdictional RED as well as VCM, provided that both have proper safeguards. And one of the problems that we are all dealing with at this moment is, I'm still reflecting on this question here. How grounded is a project is in a sense, right, with Indigenous people and local communities, and a big issue here at stake is consultation. What consultation means for developers and government officials, it's often different what consultation means to Indigenous peoples and local communities. Again, they're coming from different mindsets. So, I think we should move to see if there is more questions in the audience. But one thing for us to and I invite all of you in the audience there. I've heard that we have about 170 people watching, which is really wonderful. Thank you so much. And whatever you're sitting from, what's your work, your mission. I believe that we all have a mission that probably we don't quite know sometimes, but so from where we're standing, how can we really come together to make this work? Because if we don't make this work, for Christ's sake, what's going to happen? We have to make it work. I'm optimistic since I was a kid. So I believe, despite of all the problems that the world is in, I believe that human nature, the good thing within human nature can compel us to find a solution that works for, if not for everyone, at least for the paradigm shift that we need in society. And when I think of that, so the role, Vicky, that you're playing now, you're speaking of roles and where we're sitting, right? And then I used to be the hat on philanthropy. To me, philanthropy, public funds, philanthropy, and markets. Public funds and philanthropy, to me, in this major challenge that we have, an opportunity that we have to make nature-based solutions really work for all, is where philanthropy and public funds can fund a catalytic process. So the markets, provided that they are truly implementing proper safeguards for best practices, including FPIC. FPIC is not the only safeguard, but it's one of the most important, can come in and make it so that is a continuum of flows of finance that are going directly to indigenous peoples. And by the way, indigenous peoples, local communities, they can manage funds. This notion that they're not capable of managing funds in the heads of many philanthropists and bilaterals, and they continue to find intermediaries because they do not trust the knowledge systems of indigenous peoples, local communities to manage funds. They need help, but they are very capable of managing funds. So how would you say that, Vic, and then we can take a couple questions here if we have time for more. And another question came through: how does someone best first engage local indigenous communities to develop these partnerships by engaging before deploying capital or helping indigenous-led projects? How can someone best begin to form these relationships? So, Vic, if you can just take from what I was just talking and address this question, that'd be lovely. Thank you.
Sure. And Beto, can you repeat your question? I'm thinking now of Cameron's question, and thank you, Cameron, for asking. And what was your question?
My question is about how do you see philanthropy in particular, that's where you're sitting now, can be a catalyst for creating the enabling conditions for market finance to take it forward.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think I'll address Cameron's question first. I think that this is often this is the primary question that a lot of non-Indigenous folks who want to do this type of work are asking, like, where do I start? And there is no one answer to that question. And I feel sometimes silly and I don't mean to sound flip, but sometimes my answer is truly just to talk to people, find out what communities are in your area. Start with your own education of where am I working, where am I living, what communities are impacted by the project that I'm thinking about right now. And that stuff will be findable. Those organizations, those communities that you find will typically have a sort of government body. There will be organizations that are led by folks from the community. There will be often public events that you can attend, like at least in the United States context. There's often public powwows that communities will host in the summers. There's, panel discussions. Sometimes there's council meetings even that are open to the public. And these are places, when you can, to really try and meet people to meet them face to face, to break bread if you can. Those are really where you start, is just by getting to know someone, getting to know them as a person, communicating yourself, sharing a bit of yourself and your intentions in the work, and starting to build a relationship from there. I think that there's some other, protocols that I always encourage people strongly consider, which is, if you are reaching out to someone and asking for them to share their time or their knowledge, always that person's time, knowledge should be compensated in some way. Indigenous communities, which is probably not surprising, are getting questions like this all the time. And, there's a limited amount of capacity when you have, again, in the United States context, and I think across communities around the world, it's like people are running nations within nations. A tribal nation in the States is a nation within a nation. We have to run our schools, our courts. We have to get the roads paved. We have to make sure that people are getting the healthcare services they need, and liaise with hostile federal governments that don't want us to be successful. So people are often really stretched for capacity. And when you reach out, if you're requesting time, make sure that time is compensated, which is sort of the least that one can do, really. Also make sure that the, engagement is happening on their terms. If they want to meet on their own lands and their own space, do so. If they want to meet face to face, always prioritize that, because that's just the strongest way to begin. And I think I'll turn to Beto's question, knowing that we only have a few minutes left of the panel. But I think about this a lot, at least in the United States context. I've mentioned the hostile federal government. In the work that I do, our organizations that we partner with are like often fighting to stay alive right now, in full transparency. Many of the conservation initiatives that have been happening during the Biden administration, the funding was completely cut, staffs cut in half, if not by more. The environmental job sector for Indigenous people here really, really expanded during Biden's administration, and that's changing a lot. And so I think the role that philanthropy is being called to fill right now is to be like both a stopgap and a spark plug. I think those are the words that come to my mind. We need to keep people alive. Like the government is not going to step in and do that right now. I think that the private market will play a role, but I think that there's often less risk tolerance in the private market, frankly. And so philanthropy is really called right now to keep folks alive, to support Indigenous-led projects abundantly and for the long term, to give more now than maybe people thought that we were going to need to. It's certainly not the time to be risk averse in supporting community-led projects. It's the time to step up and keep these things going. As Beto said, we need to figure this out. It's not tomorrow. It's like now is the time to invest really big, to put some, capital, both, social, financial, on the line, and support community-led projects as much as possible.
Thank you so much, Vic. And I leave us with this thought as well, as we've been talking about market finance. And however, Article 6, also refers to no market approaches of the Paris Agreement. I think to your point of philanthropy, really enhancing those no market mechanisms that are based in instead of offsets, but what are other no market solutions that can also be supported, and yet those can also be supported by financial streams from the market, but not necessarily looking in terms of return on investment. Mm-hmm. So these are all great questions and great thoughts for us to have. I really appreciate, Vic, your insights. Really pleased to meet you. So let's stay in touch. And I don't know, Ricardo, if you might want to just bring us home here with some your often brilliant insights. Ricardo is a really good person, a good dear friend of mine, and we had the privilege of working many years together. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you all for in the audience for being with us. You're muted, Ricardo. Congratulations to Brown for its first ever Climate Week.
Yeah. Thank you, Beto, and thank you too, Vic. You're both incredibly insightful, and I certainly learned a lot around issues of Indigenous people and FPIC, and I think just this concept of how you really bring them in, and more than that, have them take the leadership role in defining what they want to do and how they want to do it and when they want to do it. And I think it's often hard. And I worked for many years in carbon projects, including working on Indigenous people's projects, and it's very, very hard sometimes for us to take the back seat, but it's so important. And when we do, everything just goes better, and the project turns out better, conservation turns out better, and nature profits. And it's that, you know, humility to be able to say, yeah, Indigenous peoples have been managing natural systems for eons. They know how to do it much better than most other groups of people out there, and so it's definitely incumbent on us to listen to them. And I think the challenge we have is that, you know, kind of the modern world is progressing so rapidly that it's just steamrolling just about everything in its path in so many ways. And that steamrolling is leading to a number of problems that we're having. You know, the level of climate environmental risk that we're facing, biological biodiversity risk that we're facing is just tremendous. And so we need all of the wisdom that Indigenous peoples bring to the table. And I appreciate the work that you've both been doing to make sure we're able to share in that wisdom. And thanks for sharing your wisdom with us. So with that, thank you to everyone. And as you know, we're going to be having a discussion at 2:15 here about nature, entrepreneurship, and groups that are trying to come up with new and interesting approaches and new and interesting business ideas on how to bring nature into you know, the balance sheet into this world. So again, thank you so much to both of you, and hope you have a wonderful day.
Likewise, thank you so much. All the best.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone.